Heide Emmerich from The With Gift, and I'm a speech pathologist of more than 30 years and a family relationship coach. I'm so glad you're here. Let's talk about perceived pressure. In my last video, I talked to you about a magic formula. Level of stress equals perceived pressure over resilience. And today we'll talk about the perceived pressure part of that formula. Now, perceived is a really important word in that formula. It's perceived by the person feeling the level of stress. So perceived, not by an onlooker. And in this case, if we're talking about you, it would be perceived by you. Now, this magic formula also works for your child or your student or even your partner. So I want you to know that. But today we're going to talk about mostly from your perspective. Okay? It's always good to work on something from your own perspective first and then try and apply it to support those around you that need some support, like your students or your child. Okay? So let's think about, what do I mean by perceived pressure? Well, pressure is anything that challenges your ability to live your life fully, to be your best version of you. So let's think about what those pressures might be. Now, these pressures can be subconscious or conscious. So you might be aware of them, or you might not really be aware of them consciously, but they could still be affecting you. And it's important to know this because once you know, you can do something about them. So let's get started. The very first thing to consider is your own vulnerabilities, the things that you were born with, that you came into this body with, right? So these might be considered your developmental capabilities, the skills, challenges that you might have, or the physical challenges, mental challenges that you may have. These are your vulnerabilities. And sometimes, and actually quite often, there is an expectation gap. Those around you have expectations, whether they be cultural expectations, family expectations, educational expectations, environmental expectations, but there are expectations all around us. And if our developmental capabilities at this present moment are not meeting those expectations, then we consider that there is an expectation gap. Now, interestingly, that expectation gap puts pressure on us. And if we consider it from a child's perspective, it puts pressure on the child too to perform at a level that's beyond their present capabilities. And now, if we're a parent of a child that isn't performing at their expected developmental capabilities, like, you know, those developmental checklists that we get and we can check off if our child's meeting their milestones, and we're recognizing that, oh my gosh, my child isn't meeting the milestones. Suddenly there's this expectation gap that has developed, and we feel pressure to somehow get our child to meet that expectation, like to meet the expectations, rather than just accept where they are at their developmental level. That puts pressure on us. Maybe we feel judged by others, or maybe we even feel shame at some level based on what our expectations are for our children. I know a family whose children just are not interested in finishing school, finishing high school. And in our culture, it's really important, everybody feels, that they finish high school. But that is a real challenge, because that expectation gap causes pressure on the parents they're feeling judged about their own parenting skills, and they then pass that judgment on to their child, and who isn't meeting cultural expectation. So that puts pressure on the whole family, but it also puts pressure on the parent, thinking about, oh, I'm being judged, or I'm judging my child. Pressure around your own or your child's vulnerabilities. So that's one way. Another thing to consider is, let's say, prenatal experiences, birth and early childhood, even medical interventions. All of these may have an effect of trauma. They're traumatic in some cases, and we don't even aren't even conscious of it at this age. In some cases, we're not conscious. Sometimes people know what's happened, but children are unconscious about that because they do not have memory of that at early ages, but something subconsciously has imprinted on them. And so to be aware that that might have an effect of adding subconscious pressure. Another thing to think about is our biology, our physiology, like our makeup. What do we need to have a strong, healthy body? And if we're malnourished, or we lack sleep, we don't drink enough, we don't exercise very much, or maybe our muscle tone is affected and low, all of these things create pressure on our system. Extreme cold or hot temperatures can put pressure on our system. Allergens, time of year, pollution, high levels of pollution put pressure on our system. We can't work, our bodies can't work optimally when these things are happening, when we are in high pollution areas. It affects our breathing, right? So there's lots that might be going on that is putting pressure onto our bodies. Another thing to think about is even our sensory processing. Different people are affected differently by their senses. Some people don't mind loud noises, whereas others can't stand them. So that can be a problem, and it can add pressure for our ability to live fully. Maybe we're really sensitive to light, or maybe to touch. Like, I don't like tags in the back of my shirts. It affects how well I focus on the present moment if I'm always feeling itchy in the back there. So that's something. Another thing would be how movement affects us. Perhaps we really like to move around a lot, but we have to sit all day, or we're not really active normally, and we're required to do a lot of movement. So our senses and what we need is different from every other person, and how we are processing those sensitivities, or if there's sensory overload or underload, will affect how we function and will add pressure. Another thing that is really important to consider is our sense of self. If we have a weak sense of self, a weak sense of who we are, and the idea, and a weak understanding that we can affect our life by making choices that are right for us. If we are always feeling pressured to make choices based on what other people think is right for us, that will add pressure. And some of us are more affected by that than others because of a weak sense of self, not tuning in to our own knowing of who we are, what we desire, tuning into our emotions and allowing our emotions to guide us in the direction that will allow us to live fully in the way that we desire. That's pretty intense. But if we have a weak sense of self and a weak sense that that's something that we can actually do, that will cause pressure, and it will affect us in how we do things. The last area that I want to talk about today is relationships. So our connection with others, with those around us, with other beings like animals in this world and the environment can add pressure, because we are all interconnected. We are connected through our energies, and science is showing more and more proof of this every day. So my energy affects you, and your energy affects me. Energy might be in the form of emotions that I am emitting. Your emotions, how you feel, affects me if I'm not strong in who I am. And the same is the other way around. So I may be feeling pressure from you, or you may be feeling pressure from me, based on your emotions that you are emitting and vibrating out towards me. The other piece of that is the information that we exchange. There's an information flow. An information flow is always energy. Energy in the words that I use, or energy in the body gestures, my body posture, my facial expressions, my tone of voice. All of that is energy flow, and it flows towards you. But at the same time, your information flow towards me is also happening, and that connection will affect me and will either add pressure or take pressure off. And consider the environment. The same thing is with the environment. Based on where we are, we will feel pressures of the environment. If our environment is filled with lots of like junk and lots of let's say outside is very polluted and filled with garbage, or not taken care of, that will affect us, and we will feel that pressure from the environment not feeling cared for. It's an interesting thing to realize that we are all connected through our energies, and so we will feel pressures from those around us, from our environment as well. Okay, so those are perceived pressures that might affect you, or be affecting you, or be affecting your child, or student, or partner. But now that we know that, how can we bring those perceived pressures into balance? Well, there are 3 ways that we could do that. The very first one would be to provide for our needs, mostly like our biological, physiological needs. So that might be fall into the very first thing I want to say is that very first most important need is having safety in relationship. So having a safe person, somebody that you can connect to and know that you are loved and not judged, just accepted as you are. Safety in a relationship like that is important. Even if it's with your pet, with your dog or your cat, a pet that loves you unconditionally and you love them unconditionally. Safety in relationship is number 1 need for all humans. We also need to be well nourished, have sleep, a good amount of sleep, make sure that we drink make sure that our digestion is working properly so that we have the energy that we need, and that the environment that we are living in is tended to and cared for. Those are the needs that we could provide for. The second thing that we can do is to actually look at those stressors and try to decrease some other stressors that we have in our life. So for example, if we are in sensory overload, we can find ways to decrease that sensory overload. So if you are really sensitive to noise, you can wear headphones or earbuds in loud situations. If you are really sensitive to sights, like to light, for example, you could wear your sunglasses or dim the lights. Change the lighting. This is important. That might help you be able to focus better. If you are one who really needs a lot of movement, make sure that you provide your body with those movement experiences. Take the stairs instead of the escalator. Take time to go for walks, move, stand at your desk rather than sit. Find ways to support that need of that sensory need of movement, for example. So we can take down stressors like that. Another important piece of that, those perceived stressors, is we could create an environment that I would call an experience sharing environment, where you are sharing your experiences with others rather than controlling them or being controlled by others. And that's a really important piece, especially when we think about how much, if we're thinking from our child's perspective, and you think about how much you use controlling language to control them, to set up boundaries for them. Consider for a moment what life would be like if, rather than make demands and ask testing questions, you changed the way you talked to more of an experience sharing, where you made comments and indirectly influenced your child or your students so that they do not feel the pressure of demand, but rather are able to use their minds to problem solve and think through and determine for themselves what would be a great thing to do in this situation. For example, if you were to say, hey, I've got my shoes on, I'm ready to go to the park. I think it would be really fun to go to the park. And let your child go, Mom has her shoes on and she wants to go to the park. I think that's something that I really want to do too. I better go get my shoes on. That's totally different than, go get your shoes, we're going to the park. There's a different feel in that, and yet the end result would be the same. And your child would feel a sense of self and a sense of agency. So creating an experience sharing environment which is filled with acceptance and non-judgment is another way to decrease perceived stresses. Another way is to decide, I'm going to look at things as things that are problems as opportunities to grow, opportunities to expand the way I think about things. I'm going to look at the glass as half full rather than half empty. I'm going to try and use my words impeccably, because the words I use matter. If I'm upset about something, maybe I'm not enraged, so I don't need to use that kind of inflammatory language. Instead, maybe I might consider that I'm just peeved by this situation. Maybe when I say things like, oh, this pressure is killing me, I might change the wording and just say, oh, this pressure, this stress is a bit annoying. The way we choose to talk about our pressures will affect how we view them. And that's important too. The other thing is, I can choose not to take on a pressure. I can choose to be motivated by a pressure. So you see how the way we even perceive those pressures matters, and the words that we use matter. Now, lastly, I also want to say that another way to decrease our perceived pressures is to actually support skill development. And skill development is around taking workshops for things that you don't know and need to build your skill. Let's say you have you've been given a leadership role in your job, and now you have an expectation to be able to negotiate well, but you're not so sure about how to do that. Well, there are workshops out there that you can take. You can read books about it, but you can increase your own skill. You're not stuck. Nobody is stuck at the place that they are at the present developmental capabilities. Nobody's stuck there. All of our brains are neuroplastic. There is hope. We can learn. Certainly, we all have our own different learning speeds and our own way of learning, but we can learn. Our children can learn and change and become even more than they are at this developmental level. It's just that we need to support that skill development in small little steps so that everybody feels empowered and does not feel distressed or frustrated. Okay, so skill development, absolutely. The other thing around skill development is that there are therapies out there too. So if you have a lisp and you feel like that is affecting your progression in life, well, you can have speech therapy, for example, to help support that skill development. So there's lots of different therapies and coaching that you can tap into, lots of resources on supporting skill development. Always thinking though that you always need to start from foundational level. We can't just start with a skill that's way up here when we haven't met some of the foundational skills needed to grow to the next level. So you could get frustrated by taking trying to learn something that you don't have the foundations for yet. So remember, start at a level where you are at that slightly challenges you. Or thinking about your child, we need to have core foundations for our skill development. Those foundations need to be in place. We can't, when we're building a house, you cannot put a window in without the walls and a strong foundation. So be careful of the skills that you choose to support. You always need to start making sure that you've got a strong foundation to build the next skill on. So those are the 3 ways. We want to provide for the needs. We want to decrease perceived pressures by the way we look at them and by the things that we do. There are things we can decrease or increase to support ourselves. And we can also support our skill development or the skill development of our children. Those are the main things of how we can decrease our perceived pressures. The next time I'm going to talk about resilience and building resilience. But right now, don't forget to download a PDF explanation of the magic formula, which will include some tips for decreasing pressures and increasing resilience. Be well until the next time.